Welcome back to US History lecture videos. I'm Mrs. Richardson. Today we're going to kind of talk about what our textbook refers to as the American dream and pop culture of the 1950s. So we're shifting out of World War II. We've talked about post-World War II a little bit. We've talked about the beginning of the Cold War a little bit. And today we're going to sort of focus on American culture, pop culture, the transition from cities to suburbs, and gender roles. So specifically, by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to describe President Dwight D. Eisenhower's domestic and foreign policies, discuss gender roles in the 1950s, and the growth of suburbs, and the effect of suburbanization on American society. This is kind of the beginning of the suburbia that often still shapes our lives today. So welcome to the 1950s, a new American era. After the Great Depression and after World War II, Americans were just craving peace and prosperity and normalcy, right? The President Eisenhower led the nation during this transformative decade. And the 1950s brought economic growth, suburban expansion, and cultural change. And so we're going to take a look at what this decade brought. Okay. So Eisenhower, referred to as the perfect president for the times. He was a military general who led American forces in Europe during World War II. And in 1952, he won the presidential election with 54% of the popular vote. His campaign slogan was "We like Ike," and the voters responded. He had never held a political office before, which made him seem like an outsider, but he promised to end the unpopular Korean War and continue the fight for communism. He chose Richard Nixon as his running mate to strengthen his anti-communist credentials. So he becomes president 1952. He has a calm military-style leadership approach. He delegates domestic affairs so he can focus on foreign policy. And unlike many presidents, he tried to stay above the partisan politics, seeking a middle ground between liberal and conservative positions. He balanced the budget while keeping a lot of the New Deal programs. He maintained high defense spending, but, was cautious about the military kind of becoming, well, let me break it down. He warned about the military-industrial complex, which was the relationship between defense officials and industrial executives who benefited from the creation of more weapons. So he kind of recognized that a lot of the economy and people were making money off of weapons and benefited from continuing tensions. And so he warned against that. Watch out for people kind of creating more paranoia and fear in order to promote their own businesses. Eisenhower focused on nuclear weapons instead of conventional forces. The strategy was called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The idea was that nuclear weapons were so destructive no one would dare use them. So sort of something like I mentioned in another lesson, where by having or keeping up with your enemy's most powerful weapons, or trying to get ahead of your enemy's most powerful weapon development, it sort of scared them off from attacking you, right? Because if they attacked you, they in return would be destroyed. And so the idea was this convoluted keeping up with the Joneses. Let's keep up with our enemies, or beat the Soviet Union in weapons technology so that they don't attack us. Because if they attack us, they know that we'll destroy them in return. And theoretically, vice versa. If we had attacked the Soviet Union, they could destroy us in return. And so both sides were motivated to not actually attack each other. The government taught Americans how to survive nuclear attacks through pamphlets and films. Students were given dog tags to identify them if a nuclear attack happened. People built bomb shelters in basements and backyards, even though most people realized surviving a nuclear blast would be nearly impossible. So why do you think the government promoted these survival guides, even though they probably would not work? I would argue to keep Americans on the same team, to create a sense of security, even if it was false, and reduce fear and paranoia. We're also going to see the space race and an education boom during this time. So in 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, which was the first artificial satellite. Americans kind of freaked out and got scared that the Soviet technology surpassed theirs. So Congress responded by passing the National Defense Education Act, which provided a huge amount of education over 4 years, specifically on math and science programs. Funding for the National Science Foundation jumped from $34 million to $134 million in 1 year. And this investment in education, even after the Cold War, had lasting impacts on American innovation because so much money was sunk into providing math and science education for American citizens. Again, sort of with the goal of keeping up with the Soviet Union or surpassing the Soviet Union, but still the things we developed had lasting effects, like this space race and education boom, which was financially supported by the government, largely in part due to the Cold War, is going to lead to America getting the first man on the moon. It was all part of the Cold War race. So after the Korean War, the president wanted to avoid being drawn into new wars. So when France was fighting Vietnamese communists, he sent money but not troops. When Hungary tried to break free from Soviet control in 1956, the United States did not do anything. When Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt, Eisenhower opposed them, threatening economic sanctions. He was trying to avoid direct conflict with the Soviet Union, believing that that was more important than spreading American influence everywhere. So this was kind of a step back from the previous president, who was willing to get involved in every conflict. But Eisenhower's approach kept America out of major wars during his presidency, which partly allowed the economy to boom. And then we get suburbia, the beginning of the suburbs, and the quote unquote selling of the suburbs as the American dream. In 1940, 43% of Americans owned homes. By 1960, it was almost 62%. Most new homes were built in suburbs around American cities. And during World War II, there had been a housing shortage, so there was a rush to create new homes. And unused land on the edge of the cities was perfect, with the GI Bill offering low interest mortgages, and the technological and industrial revolution that allowed people easily to commute from a suburb into the city for work led to the growth of suburbia America, and which was often at the time sold as the American dream. Young people were married in record high numbers, wanting to buy homes and have a family and just kind of have normalcy after multiple decades of tumultuous times in the United States, going from World War I to the 1920s, where there was a big boom for 8, 9, 10 years, and then a huge crash, a 10-year economic depression followed by another world war. Right? Americans wanted peace. William Levitt is quite famous for creating Levittown, and basically he was a developer who revolutionized suburban housing. He used prefabricated houses to build thousands of homes that were identical. They only cost $8,000 and required a small or little no down payment, and so many people could purchase them. And they had no problem with the fact that, Levitt towns were often like what we would call cookie cutter homes. People were so happy to own a home, and it was, again, sold and propaganded as like the main American dream, that white picket fence. So the name Levittown kind of became known as suburban housing. However, Levitt actually used restrictive language in his contracts to ensure that only white families could buy homes. And so this racial discrimination is going to shape suburbs for decades and promote and continue segregated neighborhoods that were very much unequal. So suburbs grew by 46% during the 1950s, and that sort of changed how the economy worked. 15 of the largest U.S. cities saw their tax bases shrink significantly, so people moving out of the city into the suburbs. Representation in the House of Representatives in the government shifted from cities to suburbs. Their suburbs are actually holding more political power now. And suburban families depended heavily on automobiles for transportation. So this led to a huge jump in car production. In about a decade, we went from 2.2 million vehicles to 8 million vehicles. By 1960, 20% of suburban families actually owned 2 cars. One for mom to drive around town and run errands with, bring the kids to school, one for dad to drive to work. Drive-in movie theaters, drive-in through restaurants and convenience stores popped up everywhere to cater to automobiles. And the first McDonald's opened in San Bernardino, California in 1954 to serve drivers who were in a hurry. Welcome to the beginning of the drive-through era, which we still have today. Because of this huge increase in automobiles, we needed more roads. So cities and states built massive highway systems. States began to tax gasoline to help pay for road construction. And the federal government provided a lot of money for interstate highways to help people commute into the cities. However, highway construction often destroyed working class urban neighborhoods, and money spent on highways meant less funding for public transportation. So this was difficult for the people who could not afford cars because they couldn't afford to live in the suburbs because there wasn't enough public transportation. because the money was being spent on roads for those who could afford cars. And so we create this divide between kind of a growing middle class and a lower working class. The government's defense spending also created an economic boom. The government was spending money on construction, automobiles, steel, oil, rubber, and lumber, and all these industries grew. So there's low unemployment, wages are decent for both working and middle class families, and then therefore they can spend money, which just boosts the economy. Most white Americans become members of the middle class during this time, right? People could afford new cars, suburban homes, and vacations. This was heavily skewed towards white Americans. As we've talked about, African Americans did not share equally in this prosperity. Most of them could not get low interest loans through the GI Bills. They experienced straight up racial discrimination when trying to purchase a home or a car, often turned down, forbidden from certain suburbs. Again, Levittown, the creator of the Levitt prefabricated homes, discriminated against Black Americans and specifically served white Americans. So by 1950, the average income of the white American family was $20,000 a year, and the average income for Black families was almost half that at $11,000 a year. This gap continues to increase in the following decade, where white families are again earning nearly double Black families. And so even though Black income increased 40%, the gap is still massive, and this is going to perpetuate multi-generational poverty and discrimination in neighborhoods and opportunities. If you are excluded because of the color of your skin from the neighborhood that has the better homes and therefore higher tax rates and therefore better infrastructure and therefore better public education because they have the funding to pay for educators, it creates this cycle of either upward spiral or downward spiral depending on which side you are on. Those in suburban life had to conform to strict rules. Neighborhoods had rules about clotheslines, lawn care, where cars could be parked, and the most important thing was marrying young and having children. The average age of the first marriage for men dropped from 23 to 23 for men and to 20 for women. And between 1946 and 1944, Americans had the largest generation in history, which is referred to as the baby boomers. Post-World War II, people got married and had kids rapid fire. It was what everybody did. Women were expected to stay home and raise children instead of working. However, 40 to 50% of women worked at least part-time, partly out of necessity and partly to afford luxuries like second cars and vacations. Perhaps it was more socially acceptable for, oh, my children are in school, I could work part-time at the local library, as long as I'm still available for my kids when they are out of school. This is okay. Things like that. We're also going to see the growth of rock and roll music, rhythm and blues, and this celebrated young love and freedom. Parents often hated rock and roll, but by 1956, 68% of the radio music was rock and roll. So all of these baby boomer children, as they grow up, they're going to become the hippie rebels. The last thing I want to talk about is the growth of television during this time. Huge. So in 1950, 9% of Americans had televisions. By 1955, 5 years later, this had gone from 9% to 65%. Okay, that's like 7 times as many people in 5 year spans being able to afford TV. This created kind of a popular culture. What was shown on TV mattered and projected the lifestyle that Americans were supposed to live, reinforcing American values and continuing to stand up against communist values. And this also would allow families to gather to watch TV, eat frozen TV dinners on folding trays, and people often, there was a limited number of shows during this time, right? So a lot of people watched the same things and then they could talk about it with their communities. Hey, did you see so-and-so on the show last night, right? Kind of created this sense of unity. All right. So we're going to leave that there for today. The 1950s created the modern American culture lifestyle that we know today. Suburbia, TV, white picket fence, owning a home, 2 cars, moms expected to stay home with children. We'll see how that kind of changes over time as women's push for the equality in the working fields. And Cold War, shaping everything from education to housing to entertainment to the space race.